Hi, welcome to today's episode. Today we are going to be discussing adolescence, social media, and peer pressure. To help us with this topic, we are joined today by Dr. Jennifer Wills Lamacq. Jen completed her degree in psychology at the University of York and then spent several years working in alternative education provision before moving on to a research post at the University of Greenwich under Professor Pam Maras. Jen then took several placements in Hackney, which consisted of working with refugee children and led a specialist project helping such families recover from domestic abuse. And now Jen delivers educational psychology services directly to schools and families. Her professional work with school specialists in supporting the mental health and well-being of primary age children, whilst also working directly with family, focusing on the parenting of young children. Her research at UCL and professional interests include parenting, early child development, including the importance of sleep, play, sand tray therapy, and the use of relational approaches in school. Jen is also currently a practicing educational psychologist. Welcome to the podcast, Jen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, to get us started, I really wanted to do a topic on adolescence. This interest was mainly sparked from seeing this Netflix series called Adolescents, where they really shine a light of the perils of social media and the current online pressures that children suffer. So, I would like to ask you from your viewpoint, what do you think are the main challenges that adolescents face nowadays in comparison to like 20 years ago or more?
Yeah, great question. And I'll give you a little overview, but hopefully we'll be able to talk in detail. So it's such a big answer, I suppose, because there are pressures from all over the place. I think that there's kind of three main areas, which is there's things about education and the way that we do education in this country, which kind of contributes to some kind of very difficult pressures on adolescents. Remembering that all schools are different and all young people are different. So what works for some children really well can actually be really harmful to other children and vice versa. But there are things around the way that we deliver education which can be really challenging. There is, as we know, now adolescents and children have a whole extra world that we didn't really have when we grew up, which is this kind of online world, which again, there's some really fantastic things about being part of such a connected generation, but there's some real harms and risks as well. And, that some of those are touched on in Netflix series Adolescents, so around kind of social media and the types of information that are out there on the internet that are unregulated. And I'd love to talk more about that actually, including like the role of algorithms and how algorithms interact with young people. And then the other thing, which is actually my huge special interest, which is around the changing world that we live in and that our children are growing up in, which is linked a little bit to how much time they spend on screens, which is that actually there is so much evidence nowadays to say that the life that children have available to them in terms of how much freedom they have, how much green space they have access to, how much independent time they have outside of the home, it has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And I've got some stats which I can share with you later, but that has such a huge impact on their development. It has a huge impact on their social skills. It has a huge impact on their mental health as well as their physical health. And for me, that is so important when we think about young people nowadays. But sometimes it gets lost a little bit because we do think much more about these things, about the pressure of exams and the pressure of social media, and we forget actually this other huge area of life which they're losing.
Really well said. I really want to dive deeper into all of the points that you made, especially like the algorithms, green spaces, and independence outside the home.
Yeah, no, me too. I would like to dive deeper into those points. And to start us off, maybe addressing the first one a little bit, I was curious as to what you think the main limitations of the education system in the UK are, and like what would be the ideal education system that would foster an environment in which there would be fewer of these pressures.
Oh yeah, I love that. I love that end question. Okay, so first of all, just talking generally. So I mean, we have to acknowledge as well that schools have a really difficult job. There are so many other kind of support services that have kind of dwindled and disappeared, that you will hear all the time when you speak to teachers, and specifically head teachers, that schools have kind of been landed with this responsibility to do so many different things and to be different things to different people. So that often schools they're not just educating, they're also kind of providing social care, and in some sense it's health education. So this is not really to bash schools, because they finding it very hard to fit everything in. But certainly in terms of my work as an educational psychologist, and particularly speaking with young people who are finding it very difficult to remain in the education system, seems to be this trend within secondary schools of kind of being very regimented. There has been a huge reduction in playtimes, and there's in many schools there's a huge reduction in kind of creative arts, so whether that's art, music, drama, and opportunities for children to engage in those things which are kind of less structured and less about academics. And all of those things, playtime and creativity, are very important in terms of that development of personality, development of social skills, as well as being really supportive for mental health. So that's very difficult. As part of this, I speak to a lot of young people, and they find that their secondary school environments also are very regimented. So the rules are very, very strong. And obviously on the one sense, for some children that works brilliantly, and in the one sense it's important. We know actually rules are important, boundaries are really important in all sorts of ways. But sometimes I'm talking to young people who say we're only allowed to go to the toilet once a day. When we move around the school, we're not allowed to talk. When we see an adult, we have to be silent and we have to stand up. And that actually, over the course of kind of, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, that can be a very impressive environment for young people. And it doesn't foster good connections, it doesn't foster good relationships between the young people and the teachers who are around them. There's also this element of kind of zero tolerance, which is the idea that if you put one foot out of line, there's a demerit or there's a detention. You forgot your planner today, well, I don't care about your excuses, you've got detention this afternoon. Things like that, which again, some children can manage really well, but actually everyone's human, everyone makes mistakes. And for some children, the idea that everything comes crashing down when you make one mistake, really, not only does it contribute to a lot of anxiety, but I think it also contributes to quite a lot of intolerance of other people. Because if you get everything thrown at you when you make a tiny mistake which you didn't need to make, you're not going to have a lot of tolerance and goodwill for other people. I have this theory, which I would love to somehow test, but generations older than me quite talk a lot about how insufferable younger generations are with cancel culture, and I don't know, you probably heard that, and I sometimes think, well, actually, if we're talking about this younger generation that have gone through their adolescence, not being allowed to make mistakes and being oh, you forgot to do your homework, right, that's it, I don't care, no excuses, you're wrong, you've made a mistake, get out. Actually, what kind of adult do you grow up into? If that's how you were socialized as a teenager, how do you feel about other people when they do things that are out of line? I just find it really interesting anyway, but that's a slight tangent. Yeah, so, and obviously we talk about exam pressures a lot, and life, the world is hard, actually. There's all sorts of difficult things that young people have to get their head around. There's, on a personal level, there's deprivation, and there's the fact that, for a start, if you even get to university, it's very, very expensive nowadays, and whether you go to university or not, there's a lot of hopelessness about future and what careers will be and what jobs are available. And even if you get a job, is it going to pay you the living wage so that you can you have a home and a family? And that's just on a personal level. There's climate change. There's some really interesting work being done about the impact of climate anxiety and climate uncertainty on young people. And and then there's war and the global geopolitical situation. There's actually quite a lot of things that young people are dealing with in the context of adolescence. And as neuroscientists, neuropsychologists, you will know what a turbulent time adolescence is for in terms of kind of brain development. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts actually on that.
Yeah, I first of all, the first thing you said about having playtime, I thought that highlights how adolescence is a particularly challenging period, actually, because if there is pressure to go from suddenly being a child to becoming an adult, then you suddenly start to feel like you're not allowed to do child things. And then only when you grow up and become an adult can you feel like you can play again and go do activities. And so I think in some cases, this can lead to people stopping doing even not necessarily like, going to the playground, but playtime, so to speak, including things like playing football with friends and things like that. And instead, people may retreat to using social media or other forms of not true play. My other thought was, yes, linking again to social media, that what you mentioned about climate anxiety and geopolitical tension influencing us. Like young people have a lot more access to that sort of information just because of social media as well.
Yeah. And there's also an element that, like, with social media, we've spoken about this before in the podcast, where it kind of like hacks into your dopamine system. And then you are so used to constantly getting that dopamine hit from social media instead of from normal joyful interactions, such as, I don't know, going for a run or spending time with your friends. It's very artificial and it's generated. And I think there's an element of that, that then if you do try to stop, it's like any other addiction. You find the small things, the other good things about life really difficult to find it satisfying in of themselves. So I guess it's a very different mental state. And I think, I don't know, from my perspective, it's the first generation that we see. Because like Clara and I think we still grew up really without phones that worked or had access to the internet, and now every kid has access to the internet, and the level of exposure. And yes, I mean, Clara can also speak about this, and that the brain is incredibly plastic, especially going from child to adult. We form so many new neural connections, and the fact that children are exposed to all of these highly curated algorithms, which I want to get back to as well, at such a young age is so scary. I Yeah, I think we all know that with algorithms, they really push people not only to echo their own thoughts, and they're in this bubble where they only see other people that agree with their own opinions, but also because the point of social media is to be profitable, it ends up pushing people into more controversial and extreme content. Like there's been many case studies that show that teenagers on TikTok quickly get funneled down into suicide content. And so it's scary, and it's also interesting the way the algorithms play a role, but we may be somewhat aware of it. And even though we may kind of not be able to help ourselves because social media is so addictive, children may not have that self-awareness, or adolescents.
Yeah, I think first of all is well about algorithms. So I first became interested in them a few years ago, and obviously I'm not a computer scientist. So like my understanding of how they work is really quite poor. But I had a few cases of children who were anxious. And so they were referred to me. And when I was working with them, the role of not just kind of social media, but actually the role of algorithms became really clear. So if I obviously I can't say specifically about the children that I work with, but I'm going to kind of amalgamate them into an example because I think it's quite an interesting example. So talking about say like an 11-year-old, 12-year-old who has access to the internet and some social media apps that her parents have kind of talked to her about and said, yeah, we're okay if you use TikTok or whatever.
Mhm.
So she's heard a rumor at school about a kind of mystery illness or a mystery event that killed everybody at a swimming pool or something like that. Because you know what children are like in terms of they will bits of information gets passed around, and actually you don't need the internet for children to create a big panic about something. But anyway, she'd heard a rumor about this mystery illness. She Googles it on her tablet or and she learns a bit about it. And actually, as she's a kid, she doesn't have the critical insight or the judgment to assess it. It's, to assess the idea that actually this mystery illness isn't quite what it's been made out to be. It's a small risk. It doesn't really apply to her. And so she's already anxious about it because she's accessed information that wasn't designed for an 11-year-old. It was medical information on the NHS website, wasn't designed for an 11-year-old. But from using Google, her device now knows that she's interested in illness and maybe this particular illness, but in general. So actually, even from that point, her targeted ads have started to change. And so whatever screen she's looking at, even if she's looking at something completely appropriate and fine, there's little bits on her screen now that are about illness. And particularly, I mean, I'll say TikTok because this is the one that comes up the most. Because when you open TikTok, you have to go on that kind of homepage that shows you videos, and that starts to have videos on it about illness, and particularly those things that are like, oh, these are the secret signs of cancer, or these are the subtle signs of a heart attack. And she's looking at it, the videos, as you've alluded to, they're designed to catch your attention, and part of that is it's oversimplifying, and it's scary because you're much more likely to look at a video that says these are the secret signs of cancer than something that's much more kind of responsible and accurate. So she's starting to see all of these things. And so she clicks on one, and then by doing that, she's told the algorithm, yeah, I definitely want to see more of these. So it's more and more and more. And within a fairly short space of time, most of her internet activity is then dominated by information about health that is designed to scare her, and it's designed to hold her attention. And to deal with that, she's 11, 12, let's say, you know to deal with that, it needs so much more general knowledge, so much more critical insight, so much more kind of information appraisal skills than she's got at her age. And so it's really feeding her anxiety, and she's dominated by thoughts of illness all the time. And all this is happening on a device that she's using, that the parental controls are on there because there's nothing illegal or dodgy about what she's accessed. Her parents have, they've decided it's okay for her to use TikTok. She's using this device in front of them, so it's not something that can be remedied by just better parental controls or something like that. This is the way that algorithms and data management works. Sometimes it's really helpful, isn't it? I get some really helpful targeted ads, but particularly for a young person who doesn't have that knowledge and they don't have those critical appraisal skills, that it's bombarding them with information that they simply can't cope with. And obviously clinically therapeutic work is around kind of, it's not just about the CBT approach of how to manage those anxious thoughts. It now has to include this kind of education and psychoeducation in like what is an algorithm, how does it work, what happens, and how is this feeding into those kind of anxiety maintenance cycles. But and some of it does come back to communication, doesn't it? If a child is accessing this kind of information on the internet, and they haven't had that information, they haven't had those conversations to say that actually this is how it works, this is designed to scare you, this is designed to make you watch more videos like this. But also, if that child is aware that their parent doesn't really want them to be using a device, and their parent, and there's already quite a lot of conflict about internet use or device use or whatever, actually, how likely is that child going to be to then go to their parents and say, I've seen stuff on the internet, it's making me feel uncomfortable? In my experience, children then hold that information to themselves because they don't want to give their parents any ammunition to say, oh, you should actually then be using your device less.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of how like something so small can be exacerbated
Yeah.
by these algorithms. And yeah, like you mentioned, I sometimes find them working in my favor, but if I'm not super conscious about what I'm clicking on, then it will go in a direction I don't want it to go.
Yeah, also, it's really interesting what you said about managing that tension in terms of like parental control, but also like independence outside the home. So how can you manage that like in the case of the phone when you may like whether it's health issues, whether it's like toxic masculinity content, whether it's like any type of extreme view or anything that is distorted in some way, it's quite unrealistic for a parent to be having like numerous conversations throughout the day, depending on what the algorithm has pushed it to. But at the same time, saying no phones, no internet may be perceived as a bit totalitarian and a bit of like an infringement in the child's rights because all of their friends have phones and their parents let them do things. So how can you, as a parent or as a person in the family, help guide children in a way, but also how do you strike that balance between parental control and, like you mentioned, independence outside the home, which is also a topic I want to know more about because I believe that to be really important.
Yeah, this is something that I do talk to parents about a lot, actually, and what I say is about starting young. And I have an analogy that I use a lot, which is about road safety, basically, because cars, motor vehicles, roads, we know actually they carry a huge amount of risk and harm in all sorts of ways. You can get run over, there's pollution, there's car crashes, but we have, on the whole, we've decided that transport infrastructure is good for us, it's good for our society, so we're going to adapt and live alongside it, and we know that. And when we were growing up, our parents or carers taught us how to be safe around the road. So we've kind of, as we're raising children, we've got this embedded idea of like, okay, one of our tasks as a parent is to teach them to be safe when we're out and about. And actually, for parents nowadays, we have a task. We have to teach our children to be safe on the internet, on the online world, on the digital world. But we don't necessarily have that blueprint for it, because I think even the youngest parents nowadays had a very different internet to the ones which their children are having. So we don't have that kind of inbuilt idea about how to do it. But if you think about road safety and how that is embedded in all aspects of raising children, we do the protective side of it and the education side of it. So babies are in car seats. We use we use pelican crossings. We have the look left, right, left again, kind of lots of things that are designed to make sure that we are safe around roads. And when we slowly encourage our children to get more independence in safety around roads, for example, they might be able to start taking like short pedestrian journeys on their own when they're, however age, when we think they're old enough. We might teach them how to cycle, and when we teach them to cycle, first they're on the pavement, and then maybe we let them be a bit more independent in a park, and then we let them in the road. Like, we're always making these judgments about how much they've learned, how safe they are, how much more independent they can be. And also at the same time, we're teaching them all the time about this world that we live in. Babies have toy cars, they have play mats where the cars stick to the roads and the figurines stick to the pavements. It's so embedded in every part of growing up that actually, by the time they're teenagers, we trust them, they walk to school on their own, because we know we've been teaching them their whole lives how to be safe and independent out on the roads. By the time they're 17, they have maybe driving theory tests where they learn a little bit more, and then they have lessons, and then eventually, when we are ready and when they are ready to do it, they're allowed to kind of be off and be free. As parents or as a society, we don't think about how much teaching and training we give children, to become like safe around roads. But when you break it down, and honestly, I could talk about that for absolutely ages, about how much we do. And when you break it down, we do a lot. And that's why, on the whole, it works. It's not perfect. Obviously, there's accidents and all sorts of, there are downsides, but that's what we do. And I think we need to get wise and get real and start doing that about the online world as well. And it's not good enough to limit children, to just limit children when they're little kids from having devices, and then have parental controls when they're teenagers, or have a ban, and then at some point when children are 16 they're suddenly allowed out. Because also we know what teenage brains are like. I think it's probably the worst time in life to be 16 and then to be allowed something that is incredibly addictive and impulsive. So I really think there needs to be this kind of acceptance that if we're going to have the internet, if we're going to have an online world, which we do, and the online and the offline world is totally intertwined now, it's not really a separate thing, is it? That we need to then kind of be as on it as we are with road safety, as we are with digital safety.
That was such a great analogy. I really like that. I would like to ask then, what tools and techniques would you suggest in terms of like training wheels, for example? Because going on the internet inherently is quite an isolating activity. You're usually alone on your phone or on your computer. You don't usually have two people researching or looking something up at the same time. Whereas with road safety, you can see it's way more visible.
Yeah, that's actually a real key, isn't it? It's making the invisible visible. I think that some of this stuff feels very, vague, but it's down to, so first of all, if you are going to use kind of screens and devices when your children are young, it's making sure you're making comments such as, actually, do you know what, you've had 15 minutes on that now. I feel like we need to get our bodies moving, because don't you feel, I feel a bit flat now, I've been sitting down looking at that screen too long, let's go and get some fresh air. And basically making those thought processes explicit, so children are hearing from a really early age, oh yeah, actually I don't feel good when I've spent too long doing that. And some of that as well, you know, is with little kids, if you are, again, if they are watching TV, which I personally don't have a problem with, but I know some people don't like their children to watch TV. If you are watching TV, it's bringing that out into the real world then. So if they've watched an episode of Bluey or whatever, you might watch it with them or talk about it with them, or you watch one episode and then you play together where you're role playing the characters, or, you know, it's things like that. So it's basically bringing it out, making it visible, making sure it's not an activity that that child just does on their own. And if you're starting that from a really early age with TV programs, you can continue that when they're a little bit older and they're starting to use games. So there's a few games that are designed for I would say older children, as in kind of like six to 10, which are things like there's a game called Tocker World, Animal Crossing on Nintendo, things like that, where you can actually play together. It's world building games, and the child might be in charge of it, but you can be part of that too, and having the conversations around it. But also, obviously, there's a lot of YouTube designed for children nowadays, and I do always urge parents to be really careful with YouTube because it's completely unregulated, and there's some stuff on there which is, you know, it's not only harmful, you know, some of it's actively harmful, but some of it is just rubbish, and there is, you know, we don't need to fill our children's brains with some of that stuff, so you have to supervise that a lot more. But it does provide the basis of some good conversations. You can, and you, again, you can sit with your child and watch stuff, and you can start in an age appropriate way to be talking about, you know, that video is misleading in some way, or give a really small example. There was, my child used to, when she was little, she used to quite like some of the like the family YouTube stuff where it would be like kids and their parents doing like wacky things, and, you know, she found it quite entertaining, but we needed to have conversations to say, you know, that is acting. Like, they're not, that's not what their life is like. They don't spend all day playing together, or they don't spend all day doing these like wacky challenges and things. And obviously these things seem like quite small conversations, but they build up over time for a child to start to understand that what they see on the internet is not real, you know. And this is why actually I kind of advocate a little bit to introduce this stuff when kids are little, and not to be totally anti-screens, because when children are little, it's a really good way of introducing them to some of these concepts in a really easy way. So again, on quite a lot of devices, you know, there's an app store and there's games you can download. And actually children from the age of about 5 are capable of being shown like how many user ratings there are and what the reviews are. And so you can have a really simple rule, like let's choose a new game to download together, but we need to make sure it's got lots of good reviews. And, you know, and just those little things, it's just introducing children in a really age appropriate way the fact that some things are bad and some things are good, and here's some information you can use. And, you know, and I could go on about, again, I've got a really long talk about this, about all the really tiny little parenting tweaks you can do to help make children more safe. But it is about, I think it, you know, the too long didn't read version of it is be there with them, do things with them, talk about it, make sure, you know, take this road safety approach, recognize it, that part of our job as a parent is to walk alongside them as they're using the internet and explain stuff to them in the same way you explain road safety, so that they're gradually building up their knowledge about it. And it takes time and it takes effort, obviously, but it's worth it, and children are capable of engaging with those issues.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and also kind of links to what you said about building trust and therefore not having them not want to tell you about things they may have seen online. And it also, I kept thinking about how, like, my personal experience with social media, like Carolina said, we're kind of in the generation like just before social media kind of took off. So well, I first got Instagram, which is like one of the only forms of social media that I really use, when it was just released. And at the time, it was literally just people following their friends and posting videos. There was no explore page or any of that sort of catered content. And now it's so different, but because I like grew up with it, I never felt dangerous on Instagram because I like was learning how to navigate it along with my friends at a time when it was much more innocent. And so, yeah, it's increasingly important to be talking about these things, and for parents to, even if they may not know exactly how it works, but to be, I guess, also like show interest in understanding that if it's a part of your child's life.
Yeah.
Following up from this topic, so we've spoken quite a bit about how to be with children when they're young and talk about things and kind of show them how to navigate the internet a little bit. But of course, as children grow older and they become adolescents and teenagers, they tend to want their freedom a lot, and they are a lot more influenced by their peers than their parents. And how can we, I guess, how can we help still guide them if that's what the right thing to do is? And again, how do we help them gain independence outside the home that is healthy, and that they have all, I guess, all the tools they need to be able to assess things? I'm also aware that like with things like the internet, but you kind of, I think, shattering the glass dome a little bit from an early age, in the sense that like some things are bad or like some things aren't true. I think my experience when you talk to a child is they assume everything is true. And
Yeah.
like if something is bad, it's like like how is that possible? Like no way, that doesn't make any sense. And so they're not as much aware that like there are good and bad things, but that that's okay. So I guess how do you navigate that? And then again, how do you help with independence outside the home and an adolescent phase?
Yeah, okay. I think there's a few different questions there. I'm kind of working along a child timeline. So you talk, I think the one part of your question, which was around how do you help children understand that some things are good and some things are bad? You're right that in some senses that's that kind of cognitive flexibility of seeing nuance and understanding how things can be two things at once almost, or that comes with age. But obviously we have similar conversations with children about food, in the sense that we try, or generally we don't want to be too prescriptive with children with food. Say like, no, that food is bad, that food is good. And conversations can be lots more about like, yeah, sweeties are really delicious, but they don't give you energy all day, so you have to make sure that you eat toast as well. Or do you see what I mean? And trying to help from quite a young age children understand that things are context dependent, and we don't want to kind of categorize things too much as being good and bad. And obviously ultimately that's really good for cognitive development, because it's a much more kind of nuanced and sophisticated way to think about things. I think your question was, how do you help children understand that? Well, I guess it's about, again, kind of having those age appropriate conversations. I'm thinking about something from my own life, actually, which my daughter saw something on the internet which really scared her. And to be fair, it wasn't even, it was actually it was a teaching assistant at school showed her it, which is a whole different conversation. So it wasn't actually something she encountered on her own, but she had seen something on the internet that really scared her. And it really stuck with her. And obviously, at first, I felt quite angry and upset that this had happened, obviously, because I felt protective of her. She was only 6 at the time. But actually, having that opportunity to be able to talk her through okay, it looked like this scary thing was happening, but actually it was made for fun. And I ended up like having to teach her all sorts of things about like special effects. And we ended up using my Instagram, actually, to how on Instagram you can put filters on things. And we ended up like spending a little bit of time putting filters on our own faces to show how special effects work and to show how it's not real, and all sorts of things like that. And obviously after a while, she understood a little bit more about this video that she'd seen, and it put it in context, and she wasn't frightened or upset by it anymore. And it was quite a valuable lesson for her to actually suddenly to understand that there's things that are presented on the internet that are not true or that are not correct. And there's been a few things since then where, again, she's seen something on YouTube which was purposefully designed to be scary, and I had to explain to her about how how people make profit out of scary videos on YouTube. And yeah, it's stuff that, to be honest, like, it's a little bit annoying to have to spend time doing that. It'd be nicer to be kicking a ball around in the football in the garden. But at the same time, that's part of parenting now. The internet does exist, and she will encounter the internet. And if she's going to encounter it when she's 16, I'd rather her have some of these very simple lessons at an early age. And I think, to say that children can understand that stuff, I suppose, and they can understand that, this is good, or, watching telly is good for 20 minutes, but then we need to do something else for our bodies because it's not good for our bodies to watch it all day. I think that's fine, basically. And it is helping them understand that this is not just good, this is not just bad, it's context dependent.
I think another thing is following from what Carolina said about how you may have less control as a parent during the adolescent period.
Yeah.
So, whilst you've definitely highlighted the importance of like setting a good foundation early on and having these conversations early on, which will inevitably influence your child's
Mm.
behavior when they are then in a position to have more independence. But do you think maybe in an adolescent period, well, surely it's important for the parents to keep communicating with their children as much as they want to, which may be more challenging given what we know about teenagers and having all been teenagers
Yeah,
ourselves.
absolutely. So that was almost like the first part of the question that you asked, and about how to help children be independent. I mean, there's two parts here. You mentioned in that early part of your longer question, which you mentioned something about independence and the importance of independence. And you're right. I think this is one of the things we talked about at the very, very beginning. So independence outside the home is really important for children and young people and adolescents. And again, it starts young. There's some really interesting research. I think it's coming out of Exeter, and Helen Dodds is the main kind of leader of this. It is around the protective effect on mental health of independence outside the home. So the idea that when children and young people are able to make journeys, for example, travel independently, make simple journeys on their own, or go to a park or the town centre or something to meet up with friends on their own, that it has really significant protective effects on their mental health. Because the idea is that in a relatively age appropriate context, so just making small journeys or going a short journey, that children to do that, they encounter dilemmas, they encounter things going mildly wrong, they encounter some feelings of kind of anxiety or nervousness about doing it, but in general they manage to do it anyway, and they can resolve those dilemmas. I've turned, the bus was late, and now I'm going to be late to meet my friends. What's going to happen? All of those things are very, very small. It's like microdosing anxiety almost. Like they're very small challenges which children can resolve and overcome. And actually doing that independently is almost like the only way they can do it in a meaningful sense. If they've got their mum with them, it's not necessarily going to provide that protective effect. It's because it's not true independence. And again, being able to go and play outside independently, and by play, I'm not just talking about going to a playground. For a teenager, play might look like hanging around at a bus stop with your friends chatting, but those things that they can go and do independently are really, really important for their development. It's important for not just their cognitive development in terms of like working out how to solve problems, and not just their social development in terms of like having good friendship skills, but it's things like being able to be resilient, being able to resolve conflicts, being able to kind of creatively problem solve things, to regulate their emotions, all sorts of things, all the things that actually are vital in creating like building blocks of like functional adults. They're all available when children have independence outside the home. But there's so much research and statistics to show that children nowadays are much less independent outside the home, and that is not actually really down to like individual parents being overprotective. That is to do with the way, I can only really speak for England. That's the country that I have the most experience of, but it's to do with the way that our towns and cities are planned. Like I mentioned about cars before, but the transport infrastructure nowadays does make it much harder for children to be independent outside the home. There's some research that came from a body called Play England. I think they found that nearly a third of children under 10 live more than a 10-minute walk away from their nearest green space. So actually that basically means that none of that green space is safely accessible to children unless they have a parent or a carer who can take them. And that's a huge barrier because children have much more free time than adults, basically. So how are those children going to use that green space? And added to that, there's a lot less budget nowadays for maintaining green spaces and maintaining playgrounds. So particularly in this country, it gets dark quite early for 6 months of the year. So actually, is there really good lighting? Do these places feel accessible? Do they feel safe? There's lots of stats as well to show that these places are much less accessible to girls than they are to boys, because girls feel more vulnerable. And are these spaces maintained and kind of kept adequate? There's also a huge you may have seen some campaigns. There's a journalist called Harriet Grant, who writes in The Guardian, who's done lots of campaigns to show that actually there's lots of playgrounds in London specifically that are only available to children who live in the expensive apartment blocks, and the children who live in the social housing as part of the same development have not been allowed to go into the playground. So there's these huge inequalities everywhere around the amount of access to kind of green space and play spaces that children have, and the inequalities that children have in terms of accessing those things independently, which has a huge impact on their development. And I think, the other side of that coin, well, actually, what do you think about that in terms of your knowledge of adolescents and young people and the limits on them and their freedom?
I mean, this is not anything academic, but I was just going to add that, of course, then the pandemic really affected everyone as well. And I just was thinking again of it was during the tapering of the pandemic, let's call it, that I was doing some nannying. And so I was trying to bring the kids also to go to playgrounds. And it was difficult to see that so many of their activities had been canceled. A lot of the clubs had been canceled because of COVID, and they didn't really have anything to do. And so we would try to go like out as much as we could, but a lot of the time parents are working from home, clubs have been canceled, like parents maybe don't want their kids mixing all the time. So that was a really challenging period.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think I'm really glad you brought that up actually, because I think we sometimes forget. And I think actually as adults, it's been easier for a lot of adults to move on from the COVID pandemic in a way that actually for children and young people, it has had such a significant long-term impact. And certainly I work with, so for if I'm working with teenagers and adolescents now, particularly those who are, by dint of my job, I'm working with the ones who are struggling. I'm not working with the ones who are kind of not encountering any problems, but the ones that I'm working with who are finding it really difficult to access education, for example, so many of them will point to the pandemic as the time when things started going wrong for them. There's a cohort of young people now who the pandemic and lockdown hit when they were at the end of primary school, and that abrupt kind of loss of primary school, which we know from kind of research is it's a really protective environment. There's a lot of kind of resiliency protective factors present in primary schools and the way that primary school education is delivered, and that abrupt loss of that wasn't a temporary loss like it was for a younger child, it was a permanent loss because those children were never going back to primary school, and not only that, they had to start their secondary school in the pandemic as well. So they had as I think you alluded to earlier, there's a way in which secondary education is delivered that's very different, and very challenging in some senses. And actually, it's really hard to be parachuted into that after having spent the best part of 2 years at home. And for some children, they never felt they got back on track after that. And again, there's another cohort of children now who were toddlers in 2020 and 2021, and they really missed out on these social experiences that would have furnished them with a lot of material for their language development, for their social development, for their emotional regulation development. And again, we're not writing these children off. They will be fine, they can be fine, but we can't deny that very abnormal part of their life has contributed in a difficult way to their development. And it's and like I said, it's sometimes it gets forgotten because that was 5 years ago, but actually it was something that influenced their developmental trajectory.
So you mentioned earlier, and I think rightfully so, that parents can't do everything in the same way that like schools can't do everything. And we're all trying to do our best to help children. Do you believe or do you think that government and policy should play a role in these issues we've been talking about? And what kind of changes do you think need to happen so as a society or like individually, like in terms of like schools or other bodies that would help with children's and adolescents' mental health, the way that they interact with the internet and grow in a healthier way?
Yeah. Great question. And I wish I was like allowed to wave a magic wand and just make some of this happen. I think for me, what I would really love, and I have spoken with MPs about this before, what I would really love is to see, for example, a children's minister who works across the different government departments, every kind of activity that those departments are doing, whatever new legislation or new thinking, someone is going, okay, but what does this mean for children? How do we represent kind of the interests of children within this? And I think, for me, really important is when we're looking at kind of there was a department for, you know, leveling up housing and communities, and a lot of that was around development and town planning and things like that, and actually nowhere in there were children being represented. Like, how does it affect children if you develop on all this green space? How does it affect children if you put a massive road in between this housing estate and that playground? And really kind of putting those things to the fore, because what I think is that for example, there's a lot of talk about banning smartphones for children, and does some wonderful work in raising awareness of the issues. But what I then want to say, well, what's the other side of that coin? Like, can we provide something else for children? If we're going to take that away, can the government then think more seriously about the fact that children have a right to be able to, for example, a right to travel safely, independently, a right to go and play safely, independently somewhere? I would love to see this kind of thing enshrined in policy much more. And again, you know, Department for Education, can we actually ring fence some funding for creative arts in schools? Can we get Ofsted to judge the quality of a school's playtime as well as the quality of their maths lessons? Those are the changes that I would like to see, because it's only when we do that, and, you know, when we kind of instill some of those, show how important those things are by putting them in legislation, by putting them in kind of judgments, that I think we will see kind of meaningful change.
Yeah, I really like that point also because that would actually benefit everyone at the end of the
Yeah,
day if we
yeah,
had more green spaces, and if they're like if our children are happier, then parents are also happier, and
yeah,
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 creating more of a sense of community perhaps as well,
yeah.
because yeah, instead of keeping like children and adults and teenagers in their own little bubbles, we can all interact with each other and learn from each other as well.
Yeah, there's loads of great evidence as well to show that the more children are out in communities, the greater ratings of well-being and community cohesion for everybody, not just the families, but for other people as well. So for me, it just feels like a no-brainer. It's a low cost, relatively low cost way to change things for the greater good. And I wish that people in power could hear that and could pay more attention to it.
Yeah, really well put. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insight into all of these issues that children and adolescents nowadays are facing. It was really enlightening.
Thank you.
It was really nice to hear your perspective from actually working with young people on these issues and yeah, having a different perspective on them. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you liked today's episode, please feel free to share it with your friends and family. Our social media handle is @neuroverse_pod. And for more resources, check out our website, neuroversepod.com. Thanks for listening.